This isn't convenient, it's very complex. And for me, there is no one answer. This is a societal issue, and we need to think about how we move forwards. And as Greg quite rightly said, how do we create space for it? This is an emotional situation. We need to stop getting into the battles and start looking at the emotional impact of what happened. Black people are quite rightly upset by hearing that word, and there are also disabled people across the country essentially justifying why they should and shouldn't be in spaces.
The BBC has apologised for not editing out the N-word in last night's BAFTA coverage after a guest with Tourette shouted out when two black actors were on stage. The BBC One broadcast was shown on a 2-hour delay and stayed on the BBC iPlayer until this morning. John Davidson, whose life story inspired the film I Swear, shouted out as Sinners stars Michael B. Jordan and Delroy Lindo presented the first prize of last night's ceremony.
Good evening. Delroy and I are delighted to be presenting the first BAFTA of the night for a vital part of movie making.
We're here to celebrate the artists who expand what's possible on screen.
Visual effects can create spectacle, but the best work serves character and story.
You may have heard some strong and offensive language tonight. If you've seen the film I Swear, you will know that film is about the experience of a person with Tourette syndrome. Tourette syndrome is a disability, and the tics you've heard tonight are involuntary, which means the person who has Tourette syndrome has no control over their language. We apologise if you were offended.
Host Alan Cumming. Let's talk to Greg Storey, who has Tourette's. He made a cameo in the film I Swear, and he's appeared in several documentaries alongside John Davidson. Hello, Greg. Thank you for being with us.
Hello. Wonderful to be on. And
here in the studio, Radio 1 Extra's Richie Brave, who was at the BAFTAs because you are a judge, so you were in the room. Greg, if I may start with you, how will John Davidson be feeling tonight?
Well, he spent his life trying to educate people about Tourette syndrome, and I don't think the irony of a film educating people on Tourette syndrome and then being linked to something like this and causing such a stir is not lost on people. I think he will be upset and probably quite distraught about this, worried for the future and the reflection on Tourette's, not because he did anything wrong, but just because the court of public opinion does tend to, when things are not understood, veer into the more negative.
OK, we're going to explore that tonight, Greg. Richie, you were there in the room. John Davidson had been introduced to the 2,500 people before it was on TV. The floor manager, in front of the Prince and Princess of Wales and all of the rest of you, introduced John Davidson, explained a little about Tourette's, and I understand there was a really supportive vibe in the room for Mr. Davidson.
There was. So he appeared on the Jumbotron, which essentially is this massive television inside, and he was introduced. The crowd gave him a cheer before the event started, and then Alan came on stage and the event started following that.
Right. And when you heard the N-word, well, did you hear the N-word being shouted out by Mr. Davidson?
Victoria, I think everyone in the auditorium heard the N-words being shouted, and the vibe completely changed inside the room. So the whole auditorium went completely silent. There were gasps everywhere. People were saying, "Oh my God, I can't believe, somebody said this." But equally, I think people were able to contextualise what was being said. It was uncomfortable as a black person sitting there, but also a moment for Michael B. Jordan and Delroy Lindo, massive moment for them being at the BAFTAs, and you could just see the colour drain from their faces. It was a really sad situation all round.
Yeah. Gregory, you've talked about the negativity online, and we've all seen it. I'm going to read one message to you, if I may, Greg.
Of course.
This is a woman on X called Evangeline. She says, "You cannot call me the N-word for any reason. I will not accept Tourette's as an excuse for that. I simply won't. Go to hell." What would you say to her?
The unfortunate use there of a particular word sort of highlights this, which is excuse. Tourette's is not an excuse. It is a medical, neurological condition that causes totally and utterly involuntary outbursts, physical and vocal. There wasn't any premeditation behind what John said, and yes, it was incredibly sad that it got said, and I don't think anyone would disagree with that. But at the same time, that was not directed by John in any way. It was the equivalent of, I would say, like sneezing, and unfortunately that was totally uncontrollable from John. It's sad that we're still in a situation where what someone can say with coprolalia and Tourette's can still be misconstrued as something that they themselves feel or, again, want to express.
Right.
And, yeah, it's hard to separate those two feelings for people. So I understand the upset, and I truly do, but I think there is a long road to go for people to truly accept that this was not something John wanted to say.
Okay, and coprolalia, the word that you have just used, describes about between 10% and 30% of people with this condition that have tics that produce socially unacceptable words like the N-word, like other swearing words, the F-word, the C-word, etc.
Yes.
Richie Brave, the way Greg has just described this condition, I'm guessing you totally understand that.
Yes, I think for clarity, when we're having conversations like this, they're not neat. Disabilities aren't neat, they're not convenient, and emotions aren't neat or convenient either. So from my perspective, I'm able to understand both sides, but what I would say is black people don't need to choose between being disability advocates or being anti-racist, right? These are very complex feelings that people are experiencing. So I think, you know, I completely hear what Greg's saying. I completely understand that. What I do think as well is when we get into these furores online and, you know, people are sharing opinions, there isn't enough space for people to feel what they're feeling. So the word that was said, and I think we're getting into intent a lot. The intent is by the by. Okay. Let's look at the emotional impact of the situation. There was a massive emotional impact on John and what he's experiencing. People from Tourette's all around the country are probably wondering whether it's safe for them to go outside. They're having to argue that they're allowed to be in spaces. And there are black people across the country and globally having to justify being uncomfortable hearing a word that essentially has horrible historical context. And I think those two things can be true at the same time. And I think it's really unreasonable to think that if black people are upset by hearing that, it means they don't understand disabilities, or like we're not an intelligent set of people. We're able to understand two things at the same time. And equally, I think, you know, like Greg's saying, just because Greg understands, you know, Tourette's and how that lands doesn't mean he doesn't understand the emotional impact of black people experiencing a word like that. It was very uncomfortable for me. Yeah. And I think those things can exist at the same time.
Absolutely. And Greg, I could see you nodding in agreement actually with what Richie was saying.
Yes, I fully agree with it. The word itself and it being delivered, there's never going to be a situation where that isn't upsetting to people. And it's something that I myself, John, and other people with Tourette's have to deal with because we do cause that upset with those involuntary actions. I think the key thing here is, and as Richie said, is being able to understand those emotions and help everybody on both sides process them. So what comes out of the end is better understanding on both sides, and then also a view to how to improve the situation next time. Is it better explanation? Is it better situational awareness, etc.? And again, we're not in a perfect world. As you say, I really agree with the statement that disabilities are messy, and so is emotional responses. So I don't think we're going to ever come to a fine point where we fully agree on the best way to deal with it. But as long as people are, from both sides, united to finding that, or at least accepting that on both sides, it's the key way forward. For me, anyway. Yeah,
and Richie, is that right? Bringing two groups of people together?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's not always bringing two groups of people together. There's such a polarisation in the conversation. There are people with Tourette's who are black. And where do they go? We're having all of these conversations and it's very polarised. Where do they go? And they've been speaking out online, they've been speaking about their experiences. And there are people from multiple different camps not necessarily listening to them. So for me, quite often, we look at these conversations as separate. There are people who exist in between. Again, this isn't convenient, it's very complex. And for me, there is no one answer. This is a societal issue. And we need to think about how we move forwards. And as Greg quite rightly said, how do we create space for it? This is an emotional situation. We need to stop getting into the battles and start looking at the emotional impact of what happened. Black people are quite rightly upset by hearing that word, and there are also disabled people across the country essentially justifying why they should and shouldn't be in spaces.
Okay, well, thank you. I hope we've created some space this evening. Thank you very much for being with us, both of you. We really appreciate it. Thank you.